in the ancient world, where gods and men intertwined, where ambition, love, and betrayal clashed like the thunderous sound of war drums, there existed a tale that would echo through the ages, the tale of Helen, Paris, and Menelaus. Their story would ignite a flame that consumed cities, shaped destinies, and changed the course of history forever. It was a story of desire and vengeance, of beauty and tragedy, woven with threads of human frailty and divine intervention. Helen of Sparta, renowned for her unparalleled beauty, was the wife of Menelaus, the steadfast and proud king. Yet, it was not the strength of their marriage, nor the loyalty of their love that would define their fates. No, it would be the arrival of a young prince from the distant lands of Troy, a prince named Paris, whose desire for Helen would unravel the delicate fabric of peace that bound the Greek world. With a face as beautiful as any woman, but a heart that was driven by love and folly, Paris's actions would set in motion the greatest war the ancient world had ever known. It began with a quarrel of gods, with beauty as the prize. The goddess Eris, envious of the celebrations and victories of the gods, cast a golden apple into the midst of a feast, declaring it to be for the fairest of them all. The rivalry between the goddesses Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite grew fierce, each claiming the apple as her own. But it was Paris, the young prince of Troy, who was chosen to make the decision. And in that moment, with the weight of the world's fate upon his shoulders, Paris chose the goddess of love, Aphrodite, who promised him the love of the most beautiful woman on earth, Helen. But the journey that began with a gift from the gods would soon lead to consequences that neither Paris nor Helen could have ever imagined. Love, destiny, and honor would be tested in ways that would shatter families, crumble cities, and lead to the fall of Troy itself. The gods would look on with cold indifference, as men and women battled for glory, for love, and for the survival of their worlds. And in the midst of it all stood the three figures who would forever be tied to the fate of a city, a war, and a legacy: the beguiling Helen, the valiant Menelaus, and the impetuous Paris. Helen's beauty was a marvel, a radiance that seemed not only to captivate the men who gazed upon her, but to bend the very laws of nature itself. She was a goddess in mortal form, with golden hair like the sunlight, eyes that mirrored the blue of the Aegean Sea, and a grace that transcended the mortal realm. It is said that when Helen walked into a room, the air itself seemed to hold its breath, as though the earth itself was reluctant to witness such a vision of perfection. Her beauty was not only her most obvious trait, but also her most dangerous. As a young girl, Helen grew up in the grand halls of Sparta, learning the ways of royal life under the watchful eyes of her parents, Queen Leda and King Tyndareus. But it was not only her regal lineage that made her a subject of constant attention. Helen was taught the arts of diplomacy, statecraft, and the intricacies of court politics. Sparta, unlike many other Greek city-states, valued strength and honor above all, and Helen was groomed to understand the intricacies of power, even if she would never wield it herself in the way her male counterparts did. At the time of Helen's adolescence, the world of Greek politics was a tempestuous one, where alliances were made and broken like waves crashing against the rocky shores of the Peloponnesian coast. The greatest men of the Greek world sought to win her hand, and the promises they made were as vast as the Aegean Sea itself. From the mighty king of Argos, to the proud warriors of Thebes, to the distant shores of Ithaca, suitors came, each hoping that the union with Helen would strengthen their own influence and cement their place in the annals of history. It was a time of great power struggles, and yet, Helen was the jewel at the center of it all, an unwilling pawn in a political game she did not yet understand. Her beauty, though she did not ask for it, was her burden, and as she grew older, the pressure to choose a suitor weighed heavily on her heart. Yet Helen, ever the cautious one, refused to make a decision hastily. She desired love, but not the kind that came with a crown or a title. She wanted a companion, a partner who would see beyond her beauty and appreciate the woman beneath it. But how could she choose among so many powerful men? each offering something different. Then came the proposal from Odysseus, the clever and ambitious king of Ithaca. Odysseus, with his sharp mind and quick wit, had long been known for his skill in both war and peace. He was not the most handsome of men, nor the most regal, but his mind had already earned him the reputation as one of Greece's finest strategists. It was Odysseus who proposed a pact, a solution that would remove the burden of Helen's decision from her shoulders and bind all of her suitors in a vow of loyalty. The pact was simple. Every man who sought Helen's hand in marriage would swear an oath to defend the man who eventually won her. This oath would bind them in a common cause, and should any harm befall Helen's chosen husband, they would all rally together to exact revenge. The suitors agreed, each thinking that the outcome would favor their own ambitions. But in the end, the decision lay in Helen's hands, and so it was that she chose Menelaus, the king of Sparta. Menelaus was not the flashiest of suitors. He was not the most well-spoken or the most charming, but there was a quiet strength about him, a solidness that reassured Helen. Menelaus was a man of honor and dignity, a king who valued loyalty above all else. For Helen, this was enough. Their wedding was a grand affair, a display of wealth and power. Guests from all corners of Greece came to witness the union of Sparta's greatest king and the most beautiful woman in the world. The celebrations stretched for days, filled with feasts, dances, and lavish gifts. For Menelaus, this moment marked the culmination of a lifetime of effort. For Helen, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one where love and duty would intertwine in ways she could not yet foresee. In the years that followed, Helen's life in Sparta was peaceful. She bore Menelaus a daughter, Hermione, and their marriage was respected across the Greek world. Menelaus ruled Sparta with a steady hand, and though the shadows of war were never far from the door, he managed to keep the peace. Yet, despite the outward appearances of contentment, Helen's heart often wandered. She had known many men before Menelaus, and though she loved him in her own way, there was a part of her that felt as if something was missing. Her days, though filled with the luxury of royalty, were often lonely. The weight of being the most beautiful woman in the world was not only a blessing, but also a curse. It was during these years of peace that the young prince of Troy, Paris, arrived in Sparta. Paris was unlike any man Helen had ever known. He was tall, dark-haired, and handsome, his eyes burning with a quiet intensity. There was something about him that drew people in, something that was both captivating and dangerous. Paris had traveled to Greece on a diplomatic mission, seeking to establish alliances with the city-states of the mainland. But his true purpose, though masked under the guise of diplomacy, was something far more personal. Paris had come to claim Helen. The story of Paris's arrival at the court of Menelaus is shrouded in myth. But the truth is less about the political intricacies and more about the immediate and undeniable chemistry between him and Helen. From the moment their eyes met, there was no turning back. Paris, with his charm and youth, was everything that Menelaus was not. He was impulsive, passionate, and daring, qualities that Helen found both frightening and exhilarating. Though the exact details of their first meeting are lost to time, it is said that Paris and Helen shared long, intimate conversations, speaking not of politics or the future, but of love and fate. Paris was a prince of Troy, and while his future was uncertain, his heart belonged to no one but Helen. He spoke to her of his homeland, of the sprawling city of Troy, and of his ambitions to make it the greatest city in the world. He spoke with such fervor that Helen could not help but be drawn to him. But even as their attraction grew, Helen knew that she was bound to Menelaus. Her oath to him, and to the gods, was sacred. She was a queen, and queens did not abandon their husbands for the sake of fleeting passion. But that was before Paris, with his boldness and unwavering conviction, whispered the words that would forever change her life. "If you would come with me," Paris said, "you could be a queen not just of Sparta, but of a new kingdom, one that would be free of the constraints of duty and tradition. With me, you could find true love, not the kind that is born of obligation, but of choice, a love that would make us both immortal. It was these words that planted the seed of doubt in Helen's heart. And in the stillness of the night, when the gods themselves seemed to hold their breath, she found herself contemplating a choice she never thought she would face. The winds that swept across the Aegean Sea were always swift and unpredictable, as if they were warning all who sailed the waters of the fickleness of fate. When Paris of Troy arrived at the shores of Sparta, those winds seemed to carry with them more than the promise of adventure. They brought with them the stirrings of a tragedy that would reshape the world. Paris had journeyed far from his homeland, from the walls of Troy that stretched high above the plain to the distant shores of Greece. Though Troy was a city famed for its wealth, its culture, and its proud kings, Paris was far more than a mere prince. He was a man of destiny, though he may not have known it at the time. His father, King Priam, had sent him on this mission not just as a diplomat, but with an eye toward forming alliances that would solidify Troy's power. Yet, deep inside him, Paris harbored a desire far more personal than that of securing his city's future. It was not just political ties that Paris sought from the Greeks. It was something far more precious. He had heard the stories of Helen, the woman whose beauty had captured the hearts of kings and princes alike, the woman who was said to be the most beautiful in all the known world. And though Paris was no stranger to the allure of women, Helen was different. It was not simply her outward appearance that enchanted him, but the idea of her, the perfect woman who embodied every yearning, every dream, and every fantasy. Helen was a woman to be pursued, and Paris was a man who, once determined, would stop at nothing to claim her. It was the gods themselves who first introduced Paris to this unrelenting desire. For, as the story goes, Paris had been chosen by the goddesses Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite to judge who among them was the fairest. In return for his decision, each goddess offered him a gift, a bribe of sorts, meant to influence his judgment. It was Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, who offered Paris the most tempting prize, the love of the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen of Sparta. Paris, young and full of ambition, could not resist the offer. His choice of Aphrodite, though it might seem trivial, was the spark that ignited the fire of destiny. The promise she made to him was clear: Helen would be his, no matter the cost. He returned to Troy with the knowledge of what had been promised. But it was not until he set sail for Sparta that he understood the magnitude of what he was about to do. The journey across the Aegean was long, but Paris was driven by something far more powerful than mere desire. It was the call of fate itself, beckoning him toward Helen. And when the day finally came that he docked his ship in the port of Sparta, it was as if the world itself had held its breath in anticipation. Upon arriving at Menelaus's court, Paris was greeted with the typical hospitality expected of foreign dignitaries. Menelaus, though a king, was no stranger to the diplomatic rituals of welcoming guests. He was a man who understood the value of alliances and the importance of maintaining the appearance of peace. First, he treated Paris with the courtesy afforded to any prince, offering him shelter and the lavish comforts of the royal court. But even in the midst of their formal exchanges, Paris could not help but feel his pulse quicken at the sight of Helen. Helen was everything he had imagined, and more. Her beauty was even more striking in person, with her golden hair cascading like sunlight, her eyes filled with a depth that spoke of both wisdom and mystery. Paris watched her from across the room during their banquets and feasts, his eyes following her every movement, studying the way she laughed and the way she spoke to her husband, Menelaus. There was something in her smile that called to him, something in the way her gaze met his that made him feel as though they were not two strangers, but two souls destined to be together. First, Helen did not notice Paris's gaze. She was a queen, after all, and such attention was a common thing for her. She had seen many men admire her over the years, and though she was not without vanity, she had long since learned to ignore the stares of those who sought her out simply for her beauty. But Paris was different. There was something in the way he looked at her that made her uneasy, as though he saw through the layers of royalty and duty that bound her, straight to the core of who she was. It was not long before Paris began to speak to her. The conversations were initially innocent enough, discussions of politics, of Troy and Sparta, of the shared cultural ties between the two nations. But over time, their words became more personal, more intimate. Paris spoke of Troy, of its grandeur and glory, and Helen began to listen, captivated by the way he described his homeland, his family, and his dreams. She had heard tales of Troy, of the great city that stood against the might of Greece. But Paris's words brought it to life in a way no story could. There was an intensity in his voice, a passion that stirred something deep within her. As the days passed, Helen found herself drawn to Paris in ways she had never expected. She saw in him a wildness, a freedom that she herself had never known. He was not bound by the constraints of duty that tied her to Menelaus. He was not concerned with the politics of kings or the obligations of queens. Paris was a man who lived for the moment, for the pursuit of desire, for the chase of something unattainable. He spoke to her of love, not the love that a wife owed her husband, but a love that was born of choice, a love that was free and unrestrained. The more they spoke, the more Helen began to question her own life. She loved Menelaus, yes, but it was a love that had grown out of duty, out of loyalty, and out of the necessity of their marriage. Menelaus was a good man, a noble king, but their life together had become routine, predictable. It was not the passionate, fiery love that Paris spoke of. The temptation was undeniable. One evening, after a banquet had ended, and the court was in its usual lull, Paris found himself alone with Helen in the garden of Menelaus's palace. The moonlight bathed the scene in a soft, silvery glow, and the air was thick with the fragrance of jasmine. The tension between them was palpable, the quiet hum of desire growing louder with each passing moment. "I came here to form alliances, to strengthen my city," Paris said softly, stepping closer to Helen. "But the only thing that has truly captured my heart is you." Helen's heart raced at his words. She had heard such declarations before, from men who sought to win her for their own purposes. But there was something different in Paris's voice, a sincerity that reached deep within her. She turned her gaze to him, their eyes meeting in the stillness of the night. "I am the wife of Menelaus," Helen replied, her voice trembling. "I cannot be what you want me to be." Paris reached out, gently taking her hand. "But what if you are not just the wife of Menelaus?" he whispered. "What if you are Helen of Troy? What if we could create a new life together? One that is not bound by duty or honor, but by love." Helen's mind was torn. She had always known that her beauty would be both a blessing and a curse, that one day it might lead her into peril. But she had never imagined it would lead her into the arms of another man. It was in that moment, under the silent gaze of the stars, that Helen made the choice that would set the world on fire. The night had fallen heavy upon Sparta, a dark curtain drawn over the palace that hid the secrets unfolding within. The flickering torches cast long, wavering shadows along the stone walls. But even in the flickering light, Helen could see her reflection. Her beauty, the very thing that had defined her, now seemed to mock her, as if her face and form were foreign to her, masks worn to deceive. She stood in her chamber, her mind swirling with doubts, but also with a longing so deep it consumed every thought, every sensation. She had never truly known the depth of her desires until she met Paris. The decision had been made. For days, Helen had wrestled with herself, torn between the love she once shared with Menelaus, her duty as a queen, and the powerful attraction she felt for Paris, a man who spoke to the very core of her being. Menelaus had been kind to her, a strong and capable ruler, but their marriage had long since lost the spark of passion. She could not remember the last time their union felt like love, not duty, not tradition. Paris, on the other hand, had rekindled something deep inside her, something primal and untamed. He promised her a life beyond the confines of her marriage, beyond the golden cage of royal obligation. Helen turned away from her reflection, her heart heavy with what she knew she was about to do. She glanced at the door leading out to the garden, where she had shared whispered confessions with Paris under the moonlight. He would be waiting for her, and once she stepped outside, there would be no going back, no return to the life she had known. As she moved toward the door, her hand trembled slightly, a sharp contrast to the steady resolve that had gripped her just moments before. Could she truly leave everything behind, her husband, her kingdom, her status as a queen, for the unknown? Was Paris worth the destruction of everything she had worked so hard to build? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. "Your Majesty?" came the voice of her maid. "The king is waiting for you." Helen inhaled deeply, straightening her posture. She knew what was expected of her. She was the queen of Sparta, the beloved wife of Menelaus. She had duties, responsibilities that could not be easily abandoned. Yet, in the depths of her soul, a whisper persisted, a voice that reminded her of her desires, her choices. "Tell him I will join him shortly," Helen replied, her voice calm but laced with a trace of finality. The maid nodded and left. As Helen closed her eyes, the weight of her decision seemed to settle in her chest, like a stone sinking deeper and deeper into the waters of her soul. She had always been admired, even revered, but admiration was not what she sought now. She longed for passion, for a connection that would consume her entirely. Paris had promised her that. Outside the walls of Sparta, Paris paced nervously in the cool night air, his heart racing in anticipation. He had not seen Helen since their secret conversations, and now, as the hours ticked away, he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had never been one to shy away from risk, after all. He had already defied the gods by making his fateful decision in the judgment of Paris. But this was different. This was more than just a challenge. This was the beginning of a war that would engulf not just Troy and Sparta, but all of Greece. Paris glanced back toward the palace, his thoughts interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. He turned, his eyes alight with excitement as he saw Helen emerge from the shadows. She was breathtaking, even more so than he remembered. In the dim light of the torches, her beauty seemed to glow, and as she walked toward him, their eyes met and the world seemed to fade away. "Are you ready?" Paris asked, his voice low and tinged with both longing and urgency. Helen nodded, but her heart was filled with a conflicting mix of emotions. She was ready, but she was not unafraid. She had already made her choice, yet a part of her still questioned whether she was making the right one. "I never thought this day would come," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "but I cannot ignore what is in my heart." With that, Paris extended his hand, and she took it without hesitation. The touch sent a wave of warmth through her body, and with one final glance toward the palace, she followed him into the night. The ship that would carry them away from Sparta was anchored just off the coast, hidden behind the craggy rocks that lined the shore. It was a sturdy vessel, large enough to carry them both, along with the small crew Paris had brought with him. Helen, still in a daze, boarded the ship without looking back, her heart pounding in her chest. It felt as though she were leaving not just a kingdom, but a life behind. But as the ship set sail into the Aegean, her resolve hardened. "To Troy," Paris declared, his voice strong as he stood at the helm, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "To a new life." The sails caught the wind, and the ship began to move swiftly away from the shore. Helen stood at the bow, her eyes fixed on the darkened coastline of Sparta, her home. But the further they sailed, the more distant her past became. She was no longer the queen of Sparta. She was something else now, something new. As the ship sailed farther into the night, a feeling of freedom washed over her. The life she had known was gone, and the unknown stretched before her like a vast, uncharted ocean. Back in Sparta, The aftermath of Helen's departure unfolded quickly. Menelaus, initially unaware of his wife's decision to leave, soon realized the enormity of what had occurred. When he found that his queen was missing, his first thought was that she had been abducted. His heart was torn between disbelief and anger. The sudden disappearance of Helen, one of the most famous women in all of Greece, could not be taken lightly. He knew that no man would dare take her from him without a great cost, and his suspicions were immediately aroused. He quickly summoned his trusted counselors and warriors, including his brother Agamemnon, the powerful king of Mycenae. The two men were close, their bond forged in the fires of battle, and Menelaus was desperate for answers. "Agamemnon," Menelaus began, pacing back and forth in his royal chambers. "Helen is gone, and I know in my heart that Paris is responsible. I will not rest until she is returned to me." Agamemnon, who had been silent until this moment, turned to his brother with a grave expression. "You are right to seek justice, but we both know that Paris is no ordinary man. He is the son of Priam, the king of Troy. This is no simple matter of a stolen wife. This is a challenge to our honor, and to the honor of all Greece." Menelaus nodded, his anger rising. "I will not allow this insult to stand. If Troy is behind this, then war is the only answer." Agamemnon's eyes narrowed. "I will gather the kings of Greece. We will go to Troy and bring Helen back by force, if necessary." The decision was made. The seeds of war had been sown, and the wrath of Menelaus would soon be felt across the entire Mediterranean world. Meanwhile, on the shores of Troy, the news of Paris's return with Helen did not come as a surprise to Priam, king of Troy. In fact, Priam had long suspected that his son's fateful decision would lead to this very outcome. He had watched Paris grow from a boy into a man, always full of passion, always willing to challenge the world in pursuit of his desires. Priam knew that his son's actions would have consequences. He had only hoped that they would not lead to such devastation. Yet, as Paris stepped into the grand halls of Troy, with Helen by his side, the city was abuzz with excitement. The arrival of Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world, was seen as a great triumph for Troy, a symbol of the city's power and allure. But Priam's heart was heavy, knowing that this moment of joy would soon give way to something far darker. The Trojan War had begun. The wind howled through the camp at Aulis, a relentless force that seemed to carry with it the weight of destiny. Menelaus stood at the edge of the makeshift dock, staring out over the rolling waves of the Aegean Sea. His fleet was gathering, more ships arriving with each passing day, each carrying thousands of warriors, many of whom had been summoned by his brother Agamemnon, the most powerful king in Greece. The ships, massive and sturdy, stood ready to sail, their dark hulls gleaming in the early morning light. On board were the greatest heroes of Greece: Achilles, the invincible warrior from Phthia; Odysseus, the shrewd king of Ithaca; Ajax, the mighty warrior from Salamis; and many others, each carrying their own motivations, their own grudges, and their own expectations for the coming conflict. But none of these men, not even Achilles, knew the full weight of the war they were about to enter. None could foresee the bloodshed, the tragedy, or the years of suffering that would come to define the Trojan War. Menelaus's heart, once filled with righteous anger, had begun to falter. His mind was consumed with the face of his wife, his Helen, her beauty, her betrayal, and now, her absence. It all hung in the air like a shadow, obscuring the very clarity of his thoughts. Could he really march into Troy, a city fortified by its walls and its warriors, to reclaim her? Was it worth it, or was there something far greater at stake here? He didn't know, but one thing was certain: she was his, and nothing, not even the gods, would take her from him. He turned his gaze back to the camp, where his brother, Agamemnon, stood, the great king of Mycenae. Despite his immense power and influence, seemed to have his own demons to wrestle with. Agamemnon had long believed in the supremacy of Greece. He was a man driven by pride and ambition, his eyes always fixed on greatness. The cause was just to him. Helen was a symbol, and reclaiming her would not only restore the honor of Menelaus but would solidify his own standing as the supreme king of the Greek world. But Menelaus saw something else in Agamemnon's eyes, something darker. The glint of ambition was unmistakable. Agamemnon had not merely summoned warriors to restore honor. He had called them to war for something more, for power, for glory, and perhaps for more than that. Menelaus, Agamemnon called out, his voice carrying across the camp, cutting through the din of preparations. His tone was low, serious. "Are you ready?" Menelaus nodded, though his heart was filled with hesitation. He had come this far. There was no turning back now. "We march for Troy," Agamemnon continued, his voice swelling with confidence. "We will lay waste to their walls, bring them to their knees, and bring Helen back." But Menelaus, still staring at the distant horizon, barely heard him. He was lost in thought. His mind flickered back to the moment Paris had taken Helen from Sparta. The look in her eyes as she had left, the finality in her steps, those images haunted him. Was she complicit in this? Or had she been swept away by something far greater than her own will? He didn't know. The sound of approaching footsteps broke his reverie. It was Achilles, the mightiest of the Greek warriors, striding forward with the unmistakable grace and arrogance of a man who knew his worth. "Menelaus," Achilles said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "We go to war. It is what we do." Menelaus looked up, meeting the warrior's cold blue eyes. Achilles was a man who lived for battle, but even in his stoic demeanor, there was an underlying bitterness, a resentment that had taken root over the years. "I know why you're here, Achilles," Menelaus said, his voice quieter now. "You seek glory, and you will find it. But this is not about glory for me. This is about reclaiming what was stolen." Achilles nodded, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "Then let us reclaim it, and let the world know that we did." Meanwhile, across the Aegean Sea, in the heart of Troy, Paris returned to his father's palace with Helen by his side. The news of their arrival had spread quickly, and the city buzzed with anticipation. The people of Troy had long revered the idea of Helen, the face that had launched 1,000 ships, the woman whose beauty was said to rival that of the goddesses themselves. But now, with her standing at Paris's side, it seemed to the Trojans as though the gods had smiled upon their city. The greatest prize of all was in their grasp, and for a moment, all seemed well. But Priam, the aging king of Troy, knew better than to allow himself to be blinded by pride. He had seen enough of war, enough of men's ambitions, to understand the true cost of the actions Paris had taken. Priam's gaze, though filled with pride for his son, was also clouded with foreboding. The Greeks were coming. They would not forgive Paris's theft of Helen. He sat in the great hall of Troy, surrounded by his counselors, his sons, and the trusted men who had been with him for years. Paris stood before him, radiant, a smile tugging at his lips. Helen, regal and composed, stood beside him, her eyes betraying a deep sense of unease. It had only been a few days since she had left Sparta, but already the weight of her decision was beginning to settle in. What had seemed like an escape, a thrilling adventure with Paris, now felt more like a prison. "My son," Priam said, his voice heavy with the wisdom of years, "you have brought us a great prize, but you have also set in motion a chain of events that may very well bring ruin upon us." Paris, eager for his father's approval, could not see the shadow of doubt in his words. "Father, the gods have favored me," Paris replied confidently. "Helen is mine. Troy has won. Let the Greeks come. We will show them our might." But Priam, the king who had seen many battles, was not so easily swayed. "Paris," he said softly, his gaze piercing, "Helen may be your prize, but there is no prize without cost. And the cost of this war may be more than you are prepared to pay." Paris's expression hardened, his youthful arrogance flaring. "Let them come," he declared. "We will fight. We will win." In the Greek camp at Aulis, preparations were now at their peak. The warriors had gathered in full force. The ships were ready to sail, their sails billowing in the wind as they were drawn up and down the shores. The soldiers were preparing themselves for the journey, sharpening their weapons, donning their armor, and making sacrifices to the gods. Among them, a few had no desire for the war, yet the collective will to fight had swept through the camp like a storm. At the front of the camp, Agamemnon stood, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The fate of Greece and of Troy was sealed now. There was no turning back. The armies would march, and Troy would either fall or stand. In the midst of this, Odysseus, ever the pragmatic king, stood by the shore, watching the waves. He had been a loyal friend to Menelaus, but he had his own doubts about the war. Would it truly bring glory, or would it leave them all bloodied and broken? He wasn't sure, but the call to arms was too strong to resist. As the ships prepared to set sail, Achilles, resplendent in his armor, stood tall on the deck of his ship. His reputation was well known. His strength was legendary. He was the unstoppable force, the hero every Greek soldier looked up to. But even Achilles had doubts. What would this war cost? How many would die? And would he survive to see the end? The ships set sail, and the sea became their battleground. A new chapter in the saga of Troy and Greece had begun. The great Greek fleet, one of the largest to ever sail the seas, was now on its way to Troy. Across the horizon, the ships seemed like a dark forest of sails and masts, cutting through the blue expanse of the Aegean Sea. The journey would take many days, but the warriors aboard had one goal in mind: to bring Helen back and to avenge the insult to Menelaus's honor. As the fleet sailed, the tension in the air was palpable, a sense of inevitability hanging over everything. The war that had been building for years was now about to unfold in the shadow of Troy's towering walls. In the Greek camp, the leaders were already sharpening their strategies. Agamemnon, the commander of the expedition, had organized the army into divisions. Each leader was entrusted with a group of warriors: Achilles and his Myrmidons, Odysseus with his Ithacans, Ajax leading his men from Salamis. But despite the unity of purpose, divisions among the leaders were already starting to show. Achilles, always restless, had already made it clear that he would not fight under Agamemnon's banner unless his honor was respected. He was a hero in his own right, and the thought of taking orders from anyone, even Agamemnon, rubbed him the wrong way. Odysseus, ever the diplomat, sought to mediate. The cunning Ithacan king knew that the Greek strength lay in their unity. If the leaders were to remain at odds, could spell disaster before the first spear was thrown. But even Odysseus struggled to contain the tension that swirled like a storm within the camp. Menelaus, meanwhile, remained focused on the task ahead, reclaiming his wife and his honor. He had lost himself in the thought of Helen, replaying her departure in his mind over and over, wondering what went wrong. Was she truly taken by Paris, or had she chosen him of her own free will? The answer, in his heart, was clear, but the pain of betrayal gnawed at him. He clung to the idea that this war, this campaign, would restore everything. But he, too, had to confront the fact that the war was about more than just Helen now. It was about the future of Greece. The Trojans, on the other side, knew that war was coming. The walls of Troy had been built to withstand any siege. For generations, the people of Troy had been confident in their impregnable defenses, their wealth, and their great kings. But now, the city seemed to be under threat as never before. Priam, the aging king, paced nervously in the palace. His sons, Hector and Paris, were his most trusted warriors, but each of them represented a different face of Troy. Hector, noble and valiant, had always been the true defender of Troy, a man who fought for his city, his people, and his family. Paris, however, was another matter entirely. His youthful arrogance had set in motion the events that had brought the Greeks to their doorstep. Paris had been celebrated upon his return with Helen. But beneath the surface, doubts festered. The Trojan people whispered about the war to come, and the old king knew that his city was not as invulnerable as it once seemed. The Greeks would come with a fury, and Troy's walls, despite their grandeur, might not be enough to stave off the storm. In the palace's inner chamber, Paris met with his brother Hector, their conversation tense but necessary. "Brother," Paris said, his voice soft but filled with concern, "I have done what I must. The gods have favored me, and now Helen is mine. Let the Greeks come. We will meet them on the battlefield." Hector, ever the pragmatist, looked at his brother with a deep sense of dread. He admired Paris, but he feared for his city. He feared for his family. "Paris, the gods may favor you, but do not forget the price of this war. We are facing a storm the likes of which Troy has never seen. The Greeks are many, and they are fierce. This is not just about you and Helen anymore. This is about Troy's future." Paris dismissed his brother's concerns, his youthful pride taking over. "We will fight. We will prevail." Hector's hand clenched into a fist, his heart heavy with the weight of responsibility. He knew that he would have to lead the Trojans into battle, to defend their city against overwhelming odds. He was not afraid, but the knowledge that Troy's fate rested on his shoulders was a burden no man should bear alone. The Greek fleet arrived in sight of Troy after weeks at sea. The dark mass of ships grew ever closer, and the Trojan sentries began to sound the alarm. The people of Troy gathered at the walls, watching as the Greeks made landfall on the plains before the city. The moment of confrontation had arrived. As the Greeks disembarked, they could hear the clash of shields and swords, the murmur of prayers to the gods, and the shouts of their leaders rallying the men. In the midst of the chaos, Achilles stood tall, his armor gleaming like the sun itself. His presence on the battlefield was enough to strike fear into the hearts of any enemy, and the Trojans knew that this war would not be easily won. Odysseus, ever the strategist, led the first wave of Greek soldiers toward the walls, surveying the city's defenses. He knew that Troy's walls were strong, but he also knew that no wall could withstand the will of a determined army forever. As the first arrows flew across the battlefield, the Trojans met the Greeks in a thunderous clash. The sound of metal striking metal, the roar of warriors, and the cries of the wounded filled the air as the two sides collided. The war had begun. Menelaus fought with all the fury of a man consumed by loss. His sword flashed as he struck down Trojans one after another, his eyes searching the chaos for the face of Paris. He would have his revenge, no matter the cost. His brother Agamemnon fought beside him, rallying the Greek forces with every step. Despite his leadership, there was something cold in Agamemnon's demeanor. He was driven by a hunger for power, a desire to see the Trojans broken before him. On the walls of Troy, Hector led the defense with a grim determination. His soldiers were skilled, but they were outnumbered by the Greeks, and it seemed as though the tide of the battle could swing in either direction. Paris, however, remained within the safety of the walls, watching from a distance. His heart raced as the battle raged below. He had led the Trojans to this moment, but he could not shake the feeling that he had made a grave mistake. As the battle raged on, both sides began to realize the futility of a quick victory. The walls of Troy held strong against the Greek assault, and the Greeks, though superior in number, struggled to breach the gates. Each day, the battle would ebb and flow, with casualties mounting on both sides. The Greeks were determined, but the Trojans fought fiercely to defend their city. But amidst the carnage, one truth became apparent. The war was far from over. The Greeks would need to adapt, to find a way to break Troy's defenses. It would take more than brute force. It would take cunning. The gods, watching from their lofty perches on Mount Olympus, began to take sides. Some favored the Greeks, some the Trojans, and the clash of divine wills would be felt on the battlefield as much as the clash of swords. Achilles, though a warrior without equal, began to grow restless. The battle seemed never-ending, and he longed for the glory he had been promised. But with every passing day, his sense of purpose began to wane. Was this war truly worth it? Would it bring him the immortality he sought? Or would it consume him, body and soul? In the quiet moments between battles, Odysseus worked tirelessly to find a solution. He knew that the Greeks needed a way into Troy, a way to bypass its impenetrable walls. He began to gather a small group of trusted warriors, including the great Ajax and the clever Diomedes, to devise a plan that would turn the tide of the war. As the sun set over the battlefield, both sides paused for a moment of rest. The air was thick with the scent of blood, and the silence that hung over the land was only broken by the mournful cries of the wounded. The war was far from over, but the storm of Troy had only just begun. The war had raged on for years, stretching the strength and will of both the Greeks and the Trojans. The plains of Troy were littered with the corpses of warriors. The walls of the city were scarred by countless battles, and yet neither side had yielded. The Trojans, under the leadership of Hector, fought with the valor of men who had everything to lose, defending their city, their homes, and their gods. The Greeks, bound by an oath to restore the honor of Menelaus and avenge the abduction of Helen, fought with unyielding ferocity, driven by the will of their leaders and the gods' meddling hands. Paris stood in his royal chambers, watching the battlefield unfold before him. Though his heart beat wildly with fear, he kept his composure. He was the reason this war had begun, the man who had taken Helen, but he had never fully grasped the consequences of his actions. Standing beside him, his brother Hector, the champion of Troy, looked grim. Hector's strength and valor on the battlefield were unmatched, yet he was weary, deeply troubled by the cost of the war. Their father, King Priam, had urged him to stay within the city walls, to let the gods and fate decide the outcome. But Hector, the true defender of Troy, could not bear the thought of leaving his people to face the Greeks alone. "My brother," Hector said, turning to Paris, "this is a war we may never win. The Greeks are relentless, and we are outnumbered. Our walls may hold for now, but I fear for our people, our children." Paris, his face pale, looked out at the smoke rising from the battlefield. "What would you have me do, Hector? I cannot undo what has been done. Helen is mine. The gods have seen to it." Hector clenched his fists, struggling to contain his frustration. "The gods may have seen it, but it is we who must bear the consequences. Your love for Helen has brought nothing but destruction upon our city. I fight for Troy, not for Helen. I fight for our future." Paris's expression softened, and for the first time, he seemed to consider his brother's words. But the weight of his choices pressed on him, and he turned away, unable to speak further. He was a man caught between the gods' will and his own desires, torn by the consequences of his choices. On the Greek side, Menelaus had become a shadow of the man he once was. The years of war had hardened him, and his longing for Helen had been replaced by the cold fire of vengeance. Each day, as the battle raged on, Menelaus found himself questioning what his life would be like after the war. Would he ever truly reclaim Helen? Would she even want to return to him after all this? These were questions that haunted him, but he pushed them aside. He had made an oath, and he would see it fulfilled, regardless of the cost. Agamemnon, his brother, was equally determined. As the leader of the Greek coalition, he had seen the war drag on far longer than he had anticipated. The gods had promised them victory, but the long siege and countless battles had begun to wear on his resolve. He knew the Greeks could not sustain this effort much longer, but he had his pride, and the honor of his kingdom was at stake. On the night before the decisive final battle, Agamemnon called a council of his commanders. Achilles, Odysseus, Ajax, and Diomedes all gathered around the flickering light of a fire. The heat from the flames mirrored the tension between them. The Greek leaders knew that the next day would be the turning point of the war. Either they would breach the walls of Troy, or they would be forced to retreat. Defeated, Achilles, his face stoic, broke the silence. "This war has taken too much from us. I have fought for glory, but I no longer know if it is worth the cost." Odysseus, ever the strategist, spoke up. "The walls of Troy are strong, but they are not invincible. We must have a plan that will break them. We must find a way into the city." "I have heard the whispers," Achilles said, his voice low. "There is talk of a great deception, of a gift that will fool the Trojans." Odysseus's eyes gleamed with understanding. "A trick, a gift to lead the Trojans into a false sense of security. It is the only way." Ajax, the giant warrior from Salamis, looked skeptical. "A trick? You would have us use deception to win this war?" Achilles nodded. "We have no choice. Troy will not fall by force alone." The next day, the Greeks began to implement their plan. The famous Trojan horse, a massive wooden structure, was built and hollowed out to carry a small contingent of soldiers inside. The Greeks would leave it outside the walls of Troy as a supposed offering to the gods, a gift to ensure their safe passage home. The Trojans, believing the war had ended, would take the horse into their city, and when night fell, the Greek soldiers inside would emerge and open the gates, allowing the Greek army to enter and attack. As the horse was constructed and placed on the shores of Troy, the Greek forces began their feigned retreat. They sailed away, leaving the Trojans to believe that the war was over and the gods had given them a sign of favor. The city erupted in celebration. The Trojans, weary from years of siege, took the horse into their walls, eager to celebrate their victory and end the long, bloody conflict. In the heart of the city, the people of Troy celebrated their apparent triumph, unaware that the Greeks were merely waiting for the right moment to strike. Paris, too, joined in the celebrations, though his thoughts remained heavy. Was this truly the end of the war? Could Troy's enemies simply be leaving? That night, as the Trojans slept, the Greek soldiers inside the horse emerged. Silent as shadows, they opened the gates of Troy, and the Greek army poured in like a flood, attacking the unsuspecting Trojans with a fury that had been building for 10 long years. Paris, still in his palace, awoke to the sounds of screams and clashing swords. He rushed to the walls, his heart pounding. The Trojans were caught off guard, and the Greeks, now inside the city, were tearing through it. In the chaos, Paris sought out Helen, the woman who had started it all. His love for her burned as fiercely as ever. But the reality of their situation was sinking in. The city was falling. Troy was lost. He found her in the royal chambers, surrounded by the wreckage of their once great city. Helen, too, had heard the sounds of battle and had seen the smoke rising from the streets. Her eyes were filled with a deep sorrow as she looked at Paris. She had been the spark that ignited this war, and now she could only watch as everything she had known was destroyed. "Paris," she whispered, her voice filled with regret. "What have we done?" Paris reached for her hand, his face a mask of pain. "It is too late for regrets now." Outside, Hector fought valiantly to defend the city, but it was clear that the Trojans could not hold out much longer. Despite his heroic efforts, the Greeks were overwhelming in number and strategy. In a final act of defiance, Hector met Achilles on the battlefield. The two warriors fought with all their strength, but in the end, it was Achilles who struck the fatal blow. Hector fell, his body a testament to his bravery. But even in death, he remained the soul of Troy, a reminder of what the city had once been. His death marked the turning point in the war. The Greeks, now in control of Troy, set their sights on Paris, the man who had started it all. In the final days of the war, Paris was struck down by the mighty arrow of Philoctetes, guided by the will of the gods. With his death, the curse that had begun with his judgment in the court of the gods was finally fulfilled. Troy had fallen, and the city that had once stood proud was now reduced to rubble. As the Greeks sailed away from the ruins of Troy, The heroes of the war were left to ponder the cost of their victory. Menelaus, though he had reclaimed Helen, found no joy in it. The woman he had fought for, the woman he had once loved, was now a shadow of what she had been. The war had taken everything from them: lives, families, dreams, and hopes. The victors returned to their homes, but the weight of their actions would haunt them for the rest of their days. For Helen, the war was over, but the consequences of her choices would follow her for the rest of her life. She had lived through the flames of war, and she would now live with its scars. As for Troy, its walls lay in ruin, and its people were lost to history. The city that had withstood the wrath of the gods was no more. The story of Helen, Paris, and Menelaus would echo through the ages as a caution.